All right, so we're moving on into the next 5 chapters of Sri Aurobindo's Life Divine here. And let me just say before we begin, man, this is a good book. This guy knows how to write and think. It reminds me, he's a complete, English was his native language. He's a total master of English stylistically. And it reminds me of German idealist philosophy. The style kind of reminds me of Schopenhauer's style a bit. Or even Spengler's in certain respects. It's really hard for me to believe that he never read German philosophy because it reads, if you like German idealist philosophy, Kant, Schopenhauer, Hegel, so forth, chances are you're going to like Aurobindo because it's pretty much the same, it has the same kind of feel to it. Okay then, so, and he wrote this, by the way, the reason that it's so long, there's a reason why it's so long. It has partly to do with the media that it came out in a journal called Area that he founded, I think, with Paul Richards. So they founded it, and his job, and they're putting it out once a month. So his job was to just come up with a chapter for the paper, for the journal. But then this was right around 1914 when the First World War is beginning, and then Paul Richards gets called up. He's French, so he gets called up. He has to leave. So he is left now with the task of filling 64 pages of this journal with philosophical content each month. And so that's why it's so long. He wrote it, I think, over 7 years from 1914 to 1920, maybe something like that, right in there, while simultaneously also writing The Synthesis of Yoga, another massive tome. So that's why it's so long. But it is a pleasure to read. You just hum right along with it. It's a little bit difficult stylistically to get used to at first, but once you do, it's like looking at a magic eye painting that just suddenly clicks into being, and you're just cruising through it. So, okay, so we left off then with Man in the Universe, chapter 6, and he mentions this thing about the universe and the individual are the two essential appearances into which the unknowable descends and through which it has to be approached. So he uses a lot of different words for the same thing. Brahman, the unknowable being, as we'll see, the pure existent, the omnipresent reality, and sometimes he uses the word the absolute. So this point is crucial because the world is not an accident. We are not here accidentally, and it is not the case. What was it, Stephen Crane poem that went, a man said to the world, I exist. Sir, I exist. However, the world replied to him, that fact does not create in me a sense of obligation. That's dead wrong. That's absolutely incorrect. That is not what's going on here. The human being has come into the world in dialogue with the universe and depends on the universe first for the descent. Notice that he uses the word descent. The unknowable involutes itself, involves itself, hides itself in matter, and then and as he says on the next page, then the next, so that's the descent. The universe and the individual are necessary to each other in their ascent as well, since Brahman hides itself in matter and then invents the world to rediscover itself again, only this time through conscious awareness of itself, coming out of the human being like a flower. And so there's a dialogue going on here between self and the universe. And for Aurobindo, the human being is the most important being in the universe. He doesn't even care if there's life on other planets, as he says. It doesn't matter. Whatever's going on other planets, this is not what's going on here. This is the axis, the center of all the universe, of all of creation. It matters what we do on this planet. There's a reason why all of this has come into being the way that it has. And so in the next chapter, the ego and the dualities, he starts talking about, well, the problem with the ego is that it sees everything in terms of dualities. Everything, ego consciousness is invented as an intermediate stage between other forms of consciousness. It's intermediate, but it thinks in terms of black and white. It thinks in terms of dualities. So it has this problem of joy versus grief, the problem of pain and suffering, death and loss, all the terrible things, but then they're counterbalanced by joy and grief and all of these other things. But beneath, beyond, and behind these dualities is the ananda, the bliss, the joy of Brahman, God, let's say, if you want to put it that way, going through all of this. And its dualities are absolutely necessary. You can't have joy and happiness without grief, death, and loss. It doesn't work that way down here. The two are essential, and they're both experienced by the transcendent being as a joyful process. Ananda is everywhere and in everything. But the ego, unfortunately, gets stuck with these dualities. Yoga is designed to get the ego out of thinking in terms of dualities and thinking in terms of the bigger picture by plugging into these higher levels of consciousness. So then in chapter 8, he moves on into the methods of Vedantic knowledge. This chapter is very much like a German idealist chapter, where he makes a distinction between three different forms of the mind. There is the lowest of them, which is the sense mind, which in Sanskrit is manas. This is the mind, the average, ordinary, everyday mind that we use to apprehend the world through the senses. And it has mentality in it. It isn't just that we see the world sensorially and then apply the mind to make sense out of it, as Kant puts it. We don't do it that way. We're constantly thinking as we're sensing. And the manas is regarded as the sixth sense by the old Indian philosophers as the sixth sense. You have the five senses and then manas, but Aurobindo says it's really the case that manas is the center with the other five senses as radiating out from this manas, which can't even invent new senses. He gives an example about holding a weight in your hand and using manas to be able to pretty much accurately tell how much it weighs. But you have to have the sense of touch there to do it first, to activate the manas. The sense of touch won't do it by itself. So the manas has to be brought in and activated with it together. And the next faculty is pure reason, which is buddhi. So buddhi is the faculty of conceptualizing. The mind analyzes, divides, pulls things apart. It's sort of equivalent to the German distinction, although not quite because of this third faculty, intuition. The German idealist distinction between Verstand and Vernunft, where Verstand is simply the understanding. The understanding is involved with the creation of categories, applying causality to effects through the transcendental aesthetic of space and time. We have these experiences that come to us, and the understanding confers synthetic unity on the manifold of appearances, as Kant, to use Kant's language. And the reason, Vernunft, on the other hand, has to do with the grasping of big religious ideas, God, freedom, the soul. So the reason does that. But for Goethe, he makes this almost the same distinction, but for him, Vernunft is the faculty of perceiving things holistically, which is basically what Aurobindo here means by intuition. So for him, and I think intuition may be a term he's taken from Bergson, for him, intuition is the highest form of thinking, and what it does is it thinks holistically. Just like if you saw my video on Goethe's morphology, Goethe was using exactly that faculty, intuition, which corresponds here to Vernunft. It's the faculty of thinking holistically, seeing in terms of images and pictures, which is a single snapshot. You've apprehended the truth of something in one holistic image, whereas reason has to ratiocinate, figure things out, A, then B, then C, then D, and perform operations on the sense mind. So the reason is applied to, the buddhi is applied to the manas to make sense out of things. But intuition for him, for Aurobindo, is the highest faculty. And not only that, but intuition is actually the activity of the supramental. So the supramental now is what we're trying to get to eventually, but it's not just sitting there. It's involved in this process. The supramental is activated in the mental through intuition. That's the activity of the supramental. The activity of the supramental, and what we'll get to here is the vital, the biological realm, has more to do with instinct. So the supramental is involved in these processes, and we'll see how his model becomes more and more and more complex as he goes along. And note the direction that he's beginning here from the top and going down toward, just like Rudolf Steiner does, everything gets denser. It starts more spiritual and gradually gets more and more dense as he gets down into the physical world. So that's the direction the book is headed. which recall is the opposite to Hegel's phenomenology, where he starts from the particulars, the world of concrete, specific particulars, universal concepts, and works his way up to the absolute, where the book ends with the absolute knowledge, which is knowledge of the absolute, which is his term for Brahman, basically, they're equivalent ideas. But they move in opposite directions. So it's important to pay attention to what direction Aurobindo is going in. So he makes that distinction between those basic faculties, and then he does this wonderful thing here. Now, I know he didn't read Spengler because I looked it up. A disciple asked him if he had read Spengler or not, and he said no. He also said he hadn't read Kant or any German philosophy, so we know that. But it's interesting, so he takes these three faculties and he applies them back to the history of Indian thought in a very Spenglerian fashion, and I think that the results here Spengler would say, you got it, right, it's exactly what I think, which is to say that the period of the Vedas down to the Upanishads is the period of when intuition was the primary faculty there. They're speaking in the Upanishads, even when they're having what appears to be philosophical debates, they're actually speaking of in terms of religious ideas, religious knowledge. A sage will ask another sage, what do you know, not what do you think? What have you there's no ratiocination going on there. These are flashes of religious insight into the ultimate truth of things. So that's the intuitive spiritual age that then evolves into the predominance of pure reason with the great Indian metaphysical systems, which involve lots of concepts, such as Sankhya, Vaisheshika, Nyaya, their logical systems, the Lokoyata system, which is atheistic and atomist. And so then finally with science, and we're down to the sense mind in alliance with reason, analyzing the sense world with modern India in its scientific phase here. So it's undergone these three different phases, following Spengler's morphology perfectly, moving from the religious to the metaphysical to the dull, boring, and prosaic. That's how all the civilizations go. They all go through that same life cycle. So now, in chapter 9, he talks about the pure existent. And the pure existent is his yet another name for Brahman, the ultimate, the absolute. But here what he does is he wants to contrast being versus becoming. So we have being, which is Sat, which is, recall, is one of the attributes of Brahman, Satchidananda, being consciousness, bliss. So there is Sat, there's being, and there's the world of energy that is moving, the world of material action, temporality. So it's the opposition then of being versus becoming, and he's careful to sort of divorce them for purposes of the discussion and to say that what he wants to highlight here is not to make the same mistake the old Indian philosophers make in saying that becoming is inferior to being and that being is the primary thing. Becoming is Maya. This is not the case for Aurobindo. Becoming is just as real and actual as being is. Yes, becoming is Brahman. It is a manifestation of Brahman. It would be what is called Saguna Brahman. Recall the gunas from last time, the qualities and traits that make up material things. So a guna is a quality. So we have Sa with Saguna Brahman, the realm of names and forms, Nama Rupa. But the ultimate Brahman is Nirguna Brahman, Brahman without qualities. That's the ultimate, although they always cheat because Brahman isn't supposed to have any qualities at all because it's beyond the possibility of the human mind to understand it. But nonetheless, it has qualities. Satchidananda. So it's very difficult to grasp in terms of its ultimate nature. And then we have this great chapter here. This is the chapter where the book just clicked like that magic eye painting for me. This is just superb. Conscious force now. So he gets into this idea. So we've made this distinction between the pure existent and the becoming. Now he wants to know what's animating this thing then. What is the energy? And he calls it conscious force, but he says it's the same thing as the Hindu idea of Shakti, which is energy, moving through all things. And he gives this little sort of philosophical creation myth at the beginning here from the Sankhya tradition, which has to do, once again, with beginning with the less tangible elements that come into being, starting with, there are 5 elements, not 4. The Hindus add space, akasha, or ether, as it's variously translated, as the first primary element that comes into being. And the thing about akasha, and this is all a self-organizing myth. For India, for the Indian mind, the world creates itself, which it more or less has. It's not a separate creator God with the old myth of the pottery maker. Our myth from the Bible is an ancient inheritance from the Sumerian idea of God as an Egyptian, of a pottery maker. That's not what has happened here. The world has become conscious of itself, through itself, and in itself, and for itself. So to use more Hegelian terminology. And so the property of Akasha is vibration. That's what Akasha does. This is where the vibration theory begins, that is essential to Hindu thought, because remember their mantras now. The mantras, Om, and all the various different kinds of mantras are meant to tap into the vibrational frequencies of the physical world. You can tune your consciousness, and it works. I've tried it with mantras. It will clarify your consciousness better than caffeine. It works. So there is definitely something to it, and not just something to it, but I believe it to be the absolute core truth of the world. Everything is based on a vibrational frequency. And then so what happens is that air then condenses and comes into being out of the Akasha. So now there are these two forces in opposition to each other, and then down comes fire, the principle of luminosity that lights everything up, and the elements get denser and denser as they come down toward Earth, with water increasing next, and then finally the Earth. And each of these will then correspond to the five senses. Akasha, of course, with its vibration, will resonate in us with sound, and Earth with touch, and fire with sight, and then air with smell, and taste with water. So those are the four elements that are echoed in us receptively through those five senses. And then he says there are these two principles, Mahat and Ahankara. Ahankara means the ego, I. That's how you say the I principle in Sanskrit. Versus Mahat, which is the word sounds. Maha means great, is the force, the great force, and the Ahankara. So how Aurobindo wants to know, does this consciousness get going? How does it form? How does it come together? And it comes together through the activity of the inactive, actually, and passive, paradoxically, Purusha. So the Purusha descends into this, and it's almost like a magnet's effect on organizing iron filings into organized geometrical lines. The Purusha is totally inactive, but once it does activate and gets into these gunas and starts this principle going, then you have consciousness. So consciousness starts coming into being now. The Ahang versus the Mahat, I versus the great universe. This comes into being, and knowledge force, desire force, and action force are the three forces then that are generated within one. And then so now he wants to know, he says that the thing about consciousness is that everything is made up out of consciousness. Consciousness has created the entire world, including matter. Matter has consciousness within it. And it is consciousness now, he says, this is absolutely crucial. Consciousness creates matter, not the other way around. Consciousness uses the brain. The brain does not use consciousness. So yeah, and he points out, and it's a good point, you don't always even need, in certain abnormal cases in the human body, certain organs might not be there or might not work properly in order to have the being living, such as a hydrocephalic, for instance, who's a guy who does not have a brain, but water in place of a brain. And these guys are real because I know that Rudolf Steiner started out by tutoring a guy whom everybody thought, because he was hydrocephalic, that he couldn't be taught. And Steiner taught him, and then he went on to become a doctor. So the brain is apparently not 100% necessary. The brain is a receiver, like a television or a radio. It's a tuning device. Consciousness does not come out of it. Consciousness is external and anterior to it. So consciousness then is what is bringing everything into being, the self-activation of consciousness. And then he says that, now we think of conscious awareness as mentality, but that's not the only kind of consciousness that we have within us. When we know this because when we go to sleep and we dream, and he has a wild theory of dreams that's even better, I think, than Jung's actually. But we'll get to that when the chapter comes on it. We're aware of other forms of consciousness when we're asleep. We know there are other forms of consciousness, or even when we've been hit over the head, or when we're being operated on. We know that there is consciousness there. So there are subconscient forms of consciousness within us, as well then of superconscient forms of consciousness. Those will be the activation of the supermental and the higher planes. So there's this whole spectrum of consciousness within which the ego is just this intermediate but absolutely crucial and essential thing in order to make all this happen and realize the divine being through the practice of yoga. And so the lower consciousness within us he calls the vital consciousness. So we have a vital consciousness and we also have a physical consciousness. So it's not just the case that we have matter, life, mind. Within us, we have all three of these forms of consciousness as forms of consciousness. The vital consciousness goes all the way down into our cells. Cells have vital consciousness. They know what to do, and the body knows how to organize itself. So it's self-organizing, it's got instincts, and that's what the vital consciousness is. And here I would say that this should be compared with Rudolf Steiner's model, where he talks about, he says that we have these four different faculties, or four different sheaths, as they're called in Vedanta. And I think both philosophers have taken this from Vedanta. We have the physical body, which we share in common with the mineral world for Steiner. And we have an etheric body, which is what we share in common with plants. The etheric body is what animates the physical body in terms of its autonomic processes, its instincts and so forth. Same exact thing as Aurobindo's vital consciousness here. And then we also have the astral body. Now here, because Aurobindo doesn't make a distinction between these two, and I think he should have, where he's talking about the vital consciousness is the same thing in plants, it's the same thing in animals. Plants have it, animals have it, but he doesn't make the distinction between an astral body and an etheric body. Plants have an etheric body, but they don't have waking conscious awareness. Everything that has waking conscious awareness has a nervous system and therefore an astral body. So there's a distinction there. And then in man we have the ego, which is the I, the principle of I, but it's also the thing, the monad that transmigrates for Steiner from lifetime to lifetime, which Aurobindo will here call the psychic being. And so we have this idea then that Aurobindo says about the emergence of life. Now, he says life could not have come from something that did not have consciousness in it. So matter must have a very sleep-like, dull, dreamless sleep type of consciousness. It does have a form of conscious awareness, but not one that we can understand. It's because it's very dull. So life had to have come out of matter because there must be consciousness in it. But nonetheless, there's still that gap to explain that gap. And he says you can't explain it by the thesis that life has come to the planet on an asteroid, because it's still the same issue. The issue is, how does life emerge from matter? It doesn't matter what planet we're talking about. How does it happen? And he says, well, something obviously has come in from another world, not another planet. He means another plane of dimension. In other words, the plane where the souls are. So he doesn't say this specifically here, but he means it. He implies it, that the first cells that come into being, the first bacteria that are created during the, the Hadean epoch, where the bacteria come in, now there's little tiny bacteria souls that have infested matter. And now it's an event. It's a major leap, a major evolutionary leap. And it could only have been started in a certain way, avatarically. Aurobindo will later talk about this idea that he has of avatars, that at certain threshold, critical moments in the history of humanity, with religious figures, we get special beings that are avatars. In a certain sense, he says, we're all avatars because we all come from another plane of existence. So we're all avatars, basically speaking. But certain beings are much more highly evolved forms of souls, consciousnesses, that come into being at crucial moments to help these transitional passages, let's say from matter to life, or from life to mind. Think of all the avatars of Vishnu. He has 10 avatars, which move evolutionarily from the fish, the Matsya avatar, and then moves to the boar, starts with animals, and then moves up to human beings, and then finally to superhumans like Rama and the Buddha and Krishna. So he has this idea of avatars, and it is possible, I think, very likely, that Aurobindo himself is an avatar, has come down from another world to give us this knowledge, to initiate what I call the fourth generation of civilization, but I'm also thinking of it in terms of a second axial age. Now, that Aurobindo does represent one of these leaps along with Rudolf Steiner. They're both in the same generation, along with Teilhard de Chardin, along with Heidegger, Spengler, Carlfried Graf Durkheim, Jean Gebser. All of these people come in to inaugurate a new generation of civilization. It was Arnold Toynbee who said that there are three distinct generations of civilization, the first being Sumero-Babylonian and Egyptian, which is not philosophical, it's entirely religious, and the second generation, which now is philosophical across the board, China, India, Greece, the Hebrews, the philosophical civilization that comes in, and then a third generation that comes in, the job of which is to create not universal states, but universal churches. So we get Christianity, Mahayana Buddhism, Islam, Russian Orthodoxy. So that's the third generation. And now I believe what we are witnessing here with these minds, these new kinds of spiritual, metaphysical, visionary thinkers that can outthink anyone on the philosophical plane, Steiner, Aurobindo, it's as sharp as the human mind gets. It isn't the case that because they are spiritual and have an aura of religiosity, let's say, about them, that therefore it's not philosophy, so we don't have to pay attention to them. That's dead wrong. That is totally wrong. Don't forget that Rudolf Steiner came out of German idealist philosophy. He studied it. He started as a Goethe scholar. He just arrived late to the party. And by that point, German philosophy was over. By the time of Nietzsche, it's dead and gone. That's the end of the metaphysical age. Nietzsche is just playing with sort of fragments of the great metaphysical age that extends from Plato to himself. And so, but he had mystical faculties, and when he hooked up with the Theosophists then he came out of the closet as a spiritual thinker. But he could think. Just try reading one of his early books, Thinking as an Intuitive Path, or whatever it was called, as a spiritual path. Reads just like a work of German idealist philosophy, as does this book. So you can't dismiss these guys just because they have a spiritual worldview. I believe that something has happened here under our noses during the world wars, which are the true disintegration of the metaphysical age on the physical plane. It had already happened on the intellectual plane with Nietzsche, but on the physical plane then it disintegrates into rubble during the world wars. And from out of that, these new guys, as prophets and herald of a new generation, a fourth generation of civilization, have come. So we'll leave it there for that chapter.